Thanks for everyone to joining us this evening, whether you've been with us before or joining us new. We are the Knoxville History Project, and our mission is simple. It's to research, preserve, and promote the history and culture of Knoxville, Tennessee, which we do every day. Also want to put a call out for our podcasts. We're going to have 3 new podcasts out on national platforms next week. And if you can't wait for that, we still have 5 podcasts that we have produced last year on our website. But you'll be able to go to your podcast app on your phone next week and listen to 3 new podcasts, and the quality and the production, we've kind of kicked it up a notch. So look out for that in our newsletter. And if you've not joined our newsletter, we send it out a big one every 2 weeks, and a kind of a program update every other week. You can go to knoxhistoryproject.org and sign up to receive that. Every month. Laura Still is with us. She's a great partner of ours with Knoxville Walking Tours. And if you're interested in joining Laura on a group walking tour around town, we'd love to encourage you to go to Knoxville Walking Tours. I've seen Laura 2 or 3 times the last few days, really, around town leading groups. So we encourage you to do that with Laura. Also want to thank the Arts and Culture Alliance and the City of Knoxville for our federal grant that we got through the Department of Treasury that are supporting this ongoing series. So thanks to all our funders and partners. And that's it for me. I'm going to hand it over to Jack Neely, Founding Executive Director of KHP, who's going to introduce Michael. Thank you.
Right. Thanks everybody for joining us tonight. It's a great crowd, and I bet it'll be a great program. I've known Michael for quite a few years. We've done a few programs together. Some at Blount Mansion, and one interesting program at the Union Avenue Books a couple of years ago. There was a lot of fun comparing Savannah and Knoxville's experience with market squares. And Michael lives, of course, in an island home, which itself is a fascinating subject. And this is has a deep history as a neighborhood, but of course it goes back to the history of Perez Dickinson, whose island home, who established his island home there 150 years ago or so. By the way, there's a new book out that we were promoting at our last Maple Hall event just on Tuesday with Linda Barron called "Of Time and Knoxville," and it's a memoir that she has edited for UT Press. That's about written by a 20th century novelist about her childhood in the 1880s and 90s Knoxville. And she knew Perez Dickinson personally and describes him in more personal detail than I have ever encountered in any other way. Perez Dickinson, by the way, was the guy I think that got me interested in my hometown. I saw Old Gray Cemetery for the first time back in almost about 30 years ago, I guess, and walked through and happened to notice this gravestone that said Perez Dickinson, born Amherst, Massachusetts. And I thought, wow, is that a coincidence? Because who's the belle of Amherst, Massachusetts? Emily Dickinson. And sure enough, as a lot of you know, this was her cousin who settled here in Knoxville and became one of the merchant princes of the city. And he had his big house on Main Street downtown, but he had his island home across the river over near the what is now known as Dickinson Island. And the neighborhood is in the area where he had these gala parties in the Victorian era. And the only description of one, really intense, personal, vivid description of one I've ever seen, is in this brand new book called "Of Time in Knoxville," and talks about the Japanese lights and what a festive scene it presented. Anyway, it's Michael's going to present something about Island Home, but especially about his little portion of Island Home, his house. We do house research in here at the KHP, but I think Michael has raised the bar for house research. We found out that a lot of people are interested in who lived in their house before they did, and we kind of have a habit of researching these things for people who want to do that, and often it forms an unexpected narrative. Sometimes goes in directions you don't expect it to, But Michael has gone a bit farther and gotten a very intimate connection to the house, and it's you could write a novel about this house, I think, Michael, and you may do that. You're a surprising fellow. I wouldn't be surprised if you did. But without further ado, I want to introduce Mr. Michael Jordan.
Well, thanks, Jack. And since I know I have friends from all over the place that are not all Knoxvillians, I see some SRC people, some Savannah people, friends and family. Knoxville History Project is a model of what local history ought to look like. It's collaborative, and it's got its tentacles out into every aspect of Knoxville history in a good way. And one of the best parts about it is that it's for people who live here. Savannah has a wonderful history, but it's a history business that's for tourists. And what I love about Knoxville is it's so supported by the people who live here and who want to know the story of their town. So as Paul mentioned, I worked at Blount Mansion, which is known as the birthplace of Tennessee. And it's a circa 1792 house museum. And I was there for 4 years, and I've been involved with house museums like the Isaiah Davenport House in Savannah, and I'd done video projects for them. I'd never researched the history of a house that I lived in. In Savannah, we lived in a 1940s bungalow. In Knoxville, we moved here before house prices went up, and we bought the house that we couldn't afford in Savannah and just fell in love with this place. It's a circa 1929 brick Tudor right in the middle of the boulevard and island home. And you can see, if you look, I don't know if you can see my mouse here, but you see how there's eyebrows over the windows? So the house kind of has a face. It's got a what they call a 100-year roof, a heavy slate tile roof. So the house is just full of character. And it always kind of just gnawed at me inside that I didn't know the story of my own house, that I'd spent years of my life telling the story of other house museums, working at a house museum that's had articles written about it. And I really wanted to know the story of my own house. And I knew that I knew how to research it from my work in archives in Savannah and here in Knoxville. But just like this Zoom meeting, it was not until the pandemic that this effort was really, it bore fruit in the pandemic, just like Zoom did. And I was able to find the time, you know, when you're stuck in a house 24/7, you have plenty of time to contemplate the story of that house and to write about it. So I can, Jack's already touched on the history of Island Home, but what's important to note about Island Home is it's one of Knoxville's first streetcar suburbs. And you can actually see one of the original streetcars in the wonderful East Tennessee History Museum. And for my Savannah friends who are here tonight, the fellow that helped create that museum, Todd Gross, is now in charge of Georgia Historical Society. So there's another connection for me between my two hometowns. Island Home is it's a gridded flat area, which is really unusual in Knoxville. It slopes steeply up to Hillwood Avenue, but the boulevard reminded us of the Ardsley Park neighborhood that we lived in Savannah. And there's these wonderful stone columns with lights on top that greet you as you come in. So it just drips with history. It's not an overlay district. You can, it's not a landmark district per se. You can do what you want to your house, but as a group, we have a very active neighborhood association and we all care about the history. So everybody really takes care to make sure that we maintain that historic aesthetic. About 2016, the original plan for the neighborhood was discovered in the Galbraith house, which is up on Hillwood. He was one of the developers. Mine is lot number 14, which is indicated with a blue arrow here. And this is not exactly how Island Home took shape, but it's pretty close. And if you look this up in the, I'm told that if you look it up in the Historical Society, my neighbor Nancy Campbell is one of our neighborhood historians, says that it's just considered found property, abandoned. It has no provenience because it was found in a house, but we're 99.99% sure this is the original plan for Island Home. So Island Home gets started in the late 19-teens, and the first people to buy lot number 14 are the Blankenships, and they really don't factor into the story here except because they were the original owners. And when you go get the deeds, you'll find in all of the Island Home deeds some disturbing language. This is a very forthright example of what's called redlining. When they drew red lines, literally that happened in Detroit in the early 20th century, but it happened here in Knoxville too, just without the actual red lines. There was an intentional effort to keep Black people out of neighborhoods. So this is a proviso clip from our original deed that says this will not be sold, granted, devised, or otherwise conveyed, leased, rented to, or acquired or owned by any Negro for a period of 99 years. So this would have just expired in 2018 if civil rights law hadn't outlawed it. So it's an example of what was definitely, I don't want to get political, but there definitely was systemic racism in that time. And, a dark part of our history, but it's one that's important to acknowledge. So the Blankenships hold the lot for about 4 years, and you can find them in city directories. They wind up moving to Asheville, where he owns the Asheville Battery Company, and they sell the lot to the first real characters in the story, which is Beatrice and John Spears. And this is the only picture I have of either one of them. John was a traveling hat salesman, and I don't know for certain what that means, because the history of the Worth, the Harris Polk Hat Company and Worth hats is a little sketchy. Based on what I have gathered from my reading, I'm pretty sure he was a traveling salesman. He was gone all the time. So I assume that rather than going door to door to sell hats, John probably visited store managers and tried to place these hats in a retail setting. And I'll get into how I found all this out later, but I'm certain of the sales price. It was they bought it for just under $1,000 and proceeded to build a house. That's the house I live in 1929. So it takes them 10 years of owning the land to actually build the house. And at the time it was a $10,000 house, and we can talk about how values change later. And I actually was able to find out that they had a $1,600 lien and paid $80 every 6 months. So it's definitely a lot more expensive in absolute or relative terms to own a house now. John was really a scoundrel. But first, before we get into the juicy stuff here, let me show you a couple of things this is how you can tell when your house is built. These are the city of Knoxville tax records for the property. As a piece of land and as a house. And you can see in 1928, the tax they pay per year is $600, and it jumps to $5,200 or $6,500 the next year. So that's how we know when the house is built. So here is the document that really was the tip of the iceberg that revealed the story of this house to me. In 1940, June 8th, Beatrice Spears filed for divorce. And this was in an era when you could not get a no-fault divorce. You had to prove that there was a reason for the divorce, especially in this time period if you were a woman. And Beatrice lays out in 19 pages just an astonishing series of allegations against John. And I hope there's not any children listening. I'll try to couch my language so that we're safe, but I know that this couple was married when she was still a teenager and he was a young, in his early 20s in Morristown. And she alleges that he impregnated her and then forced her to have a procedure with a doctor that came to the house and didn't tell her what it was. And it obviously was an abortion. She became sterile, and she says that he, quote, cursed and reviled her for years for being sterile, even though he never actually wanted children. And so this was the beginning of the dysfunction, if you will, in their marriage. Beatrice alleges in her complaint that John regularly drank whiskey to excess. He also had a taste for beer and honky-tonks. And he, I'm quoting her here, gets drunk, vomits all over himself, all over the bed and the bed clothing, on the floor, in the bathroom, and frequently gets down and wallows in filth. And that's a direct quote. She complains that she frequently had to drag her semi-conscious husband across the floor to the bed, undress him, put him in bed, after which he would awaken, still covered in the detritus of his debauchery, and demand affectionate attentions. So suffice to say, John was a difficult man. And I can tell you that as you research your house history, it's possible you're going to find out things you don't want to know, because this is the room that I sleep in every night. So sometimes I wonder if these walls could talk, if I'd really want to hear all the stories that they would tell. Beatrice was afraid of John. She said that he would scream at the top of his voice, accusing her of cheating on him and calling her profane names. And interestingly, this happens at parties in the neighborhood. She alleges that he would get drunk at the parties and accuse everybody there of having relationships with his wife. But the reality was quite different, because John, according to Beatrice, was the cheater. She alleges that she was getting mail and phone calls from women that he dated on his sales calls. And excuse me, just a second. Hi, I'm in the middle of my Zoom. Okay, my son wants to say hello, sorry. She says that he even accused her of having a relationship with her own 13-year-old cousin who lived in the house and their black chauffeur. So John was making wild accusations while he was seeing other women on his sales calls and receiving mail and phone call from those women in this house. John would occasionally get violent. She was afraid of him. And it really came to the head at this one party in late spring of 1940 when John was drunk and he passed out, as he often did, according to Beatrice. She called her father and brother in Morristown, and they came to town. And John was so angry when he realized that he was, found out, and he was so embarrassed that he began to threaten her, and he threatened to beat her. And she was so afraid she left the house and went back to Morristown. And John allegedly wandered up and down the alley behind my house, ranting and raving about how he was going to leave her, cursing her, calling her terrible names. And we assumed everything was over. So finally, at some point in 1940, early June, Beatrice has enough. She files for divorce, and she's granted everything. She gets the house. And this is what really makes this divorce paper such a treasure trove of information. It lists the mortgages that they held, which banks held the mortgage, the amounts of the mortgages, the types of cars that they had, the make and the model, even the license number of one of the cars. And Beatrice gets everything, including a restraining order. And interestingly, in the finding, the judge says, and this is what's so surprising to me, in spite of all the things that she alleges in the document, he says, I can't find evidence of alcohol abuse, but I do find evidence of the threat of violence. So she wins the case. She gets everything. John issued a one-page pleading where he said, I disavow all of this, none of it is true, but he didn't go into detail in any of the allegations. And here's the real shocker, and it might not shock you if you are familiar with the way history works. Women were under incredible social pressure back then, and to be a divorced woman was difficult. John and Beatrice remarried 6 months later in McMinn County, which is southwest of Knoxville. And I can only imagine that they remarried in a different county because of the restraining order. If they had walked into the Knox County courthouse and the deputies were aware of who John was, he would have been arrested. I have no idea why Beatrice remarried him or why she took him back, but he lived 4 more years until he died of what's essentially a heart attack. They used some fancier words for it in the death certificate. He was pronounced dead at Fort Sanders. But the funeral was held in my house. As one of my co-anchors when I was doing the news in Savannah would say, he was funeralized right here in this house. And the really funny thing, if you look at the fine print on this obituary from the Knoxville News Sentinel, is his pallbearers include some of the most prominent citizens of South Knoxville and residents in this neighborhood, the Cullums, the McCalls, and the presiding person at the funeral is Dr. Clifford Barber. He was the longtime pastor at Second Presbyterian, went on to be a dean of a Presbyterian theological seminary, and was famously the mentor to Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, who was actually an ordained Presbyterian minister. So this is a big deal pastor and important local neighbors, people who would have heard John walking up and down the alley in a drunken stupor, covered in his own filth, screaming at obscenities at the top of his lungs about how he's going to leave that you-know-what. Now he's remarried to her, and these people come to the house to honor him in death. And I have spoken at length to the staff at Second Presbyterian. Apparently no records survive from this period. I wonder if, did John find Jesus, maybe? Did he change his ways? Perhaps he made a large donation to the church. I don't know. But they were married for 4 years after the remarriage. Interestingly, though, there is still, was still until the early 2000s, evidence of John's misdeeds in the house, because the folks I'm going to tell you about later who renovated and flipped this house in 2006 actually found 1930s and 40s pornography inside the walls. And Beatrice had talked about how John would stash these foul magazines, and she uses really florid, almost Victorian language to describe the unnatural acts. I can only imagine that these magazines would appear like a Betty Boop cartoon to us now, or maybe perhaps as as colorful as the nose art on a World War II bomber, but for Beatrice Spears, they were shocking. So having John out of the picture, Beatrice now apparently has come into some money because John has passed, and she decides to rent the house for a year to this family. And one of the people in this picture is here, Dorinda Kelly. This is Morris and Ann Bocock. They rented this house on Island Home Boulevard for 1 year. And here you see Morris and Ann, and there's little Dorinda, and here's her late brother, George. And though they were only here for a year, thanks to Dorinda, I have more documentary evidence of things that happened in the house in this period than I do for the more than a decade that the Spears owned it after they built it. Suffice to say that while we can see Beatrice Spears as a victim in the story of her husband and his mistreatment of her and her divorce, she becomes the villain in this story because she was apparently a nasty landlord. And I can't say that I blame her after what she went through. That, you know, she had tried to manage John Spears's money. Beatrice had. She even worked alongside him for a time, and apparently he blew it all in juke joints and honky tonks in Knoxville. So she was a very oppressive landlord. Here's some more pictures of the Bocock family. And it's important to note that we don't have any pictures of them when they lived in this house. These pictures were taken a short time earlier in one case and later in another. But what we have, thanks to Dorinda, is a trove of letters. And the coolest thing for me as a local historian about these letters is that they're written from my house on stationery that bears the address of my house. This is the old address, 126 Island Home Boulevard, before they renumbered in 1950. And they've come back to my house now, thanks to Dorinda. And we find poor Ann Bocock complaining to her husband about Mrs. Spears just coming around all the time, and she's not going to be happy that we have children here, and I've got to clean up everything before she gets here. And she complains about how overbearing this woman is. And interestingly, we find evidence in these letters that Beatrice Spears was using the same lawyer in her real estate affairs as she did for her divorce, Jenkins. And Jack, I'd love it if I could have you dig into who he was and what role he plays into this story. It's just Jenkins and Jenkins, and I don't know a first name. Morris Bocock was a Labor Department inspector. So this is Roosevelt era. It's you're talking about, 1944, late World War II, and there's all these government agencies. And Morris's job was to go, as I understand it, and make sure that companies in this area were paying the correct government specified wages to employees. So they were always worried he might have to move. Beatrice Spears wanted to put them in a lease. And in these letters, Ann is arguing, look, Morris, just go ahead and sign the lease because we can always get out of it. You're a government federal employee. They can't make you stay. They can't make you honor this lease, but don't tell Mrs. Spears. And she says, find a lawyer up there. And I think he was in Kingsport at the time. She says, find a lawyer in Kingsport. Don't mention it down here because Beatrice Spears has got Jenkins looking into everything. It didn't work out. They didn't get to stay. They weren't willing to sign the lease. Beatrice decided to sell the house, and they were here from August to August of 43 to 44. And here is another piece of treasure, another artifact about the house. This is the sales ad that Beatrice Spears put in the Knoxville News Sentinel for the house. Beautiful 7-room brick modern home with tile roof. That's a piece of evidence. I know that the tile roof on the house now was put in 2011. So the question was how long it had been here. There's the original roof. It was always here, completely furnished or unfurnished. And then there's the phone number for the house, right? So there's all kind of information here that you can glean. So I want to pause, and Dorinda Kelly is joining us from California. Dorinda, your first childhood memory, you said, was sitting on the bare floor in my living room. And I think the first time you told me, I thought you said a bearskin rug, and we had to correct that in the first draft of what I wrote. But can you talk about your memories of this house? And you talked about the big snowfall. What was it like to live here?
I'm not sure that you can hear me.
We can. I can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Mhm.
Oh my, I'm having to do this from my Android phone because apparently my PC did not have the update that it was supposed to, but I'm so delighted. Well, let me tell you, when I corrected Michael about the first memory being on a bearskin rug. I assured him that that came on many, 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 many years later for me. But at any rate, the snow scene was one of my earliest memories. And Daddy had taken an orange crate, and I remember, and made a sled, tied rope to it. And my brother was in the front portion of the orange crate and I in the back. And Daddy pulled us down the hill. I'm sure it probably was just the lawn hill. It might have been the road. I don't know, but that was a wonderful memory for me. But I was very small, you know, Michael. I was just so delighted to be able to know that my mother and father had saved these letters, and how wonderful it was that you have done such a beautiful job in retelling their short period of time there. Thank you.
Well, I was just delighted to reach you. Dorinda is a children's book author and has had a fascinating life. Didn't you work for the FBI at one point?
Yes, I did. I left Tennessee. We had gone to San Francisco and then back to Tennessee. And I left there when I had graduated from high school and was at a flunky airline school in Kansas City and had never flown and really didn't want to fly. And also at that time, you had to show your knees to see if they were sufficient for flying or with skirts. And I did not pass the aesthetics of my knees, but they were very strong. And the FBI was recruiting for clerks, and they didn't care what your knees looked like. So I was hired and started at 7th and Market Street in San Francisco for the FBI, where later my husband worked as a clerk, and we did so until 67. So yes, a lot of stories there too.
Well, thank you so much, Dorinda, and thanks for being willing to share your letters with me. So again, we've got the Blankenships that own the land for 4 years, and then the Spears come in, build the house, and they live in the house from 1929 to 1943 with all the crazy things that were happening. And then we get the Bococks for 1 year. And there's, in these letters, Anne Bocock really reveals her true feelings about Beatrice Spears. She says she's dumb. And she's upset with Beatrice because the phone registration in the phone book had been under Spears's name, and they wanted to have it changed to Bocock. And she thought they were arguing about the phone bill, and she really didn't waste any words. She kind of got her revenge on Beatrice Spears, I think, by moving out. After this, we get another family for a period of 3 years. This is Howard and Ruth George. These again are Morristown folks, and you know, the people that had the Spears were Morristown folks, and so were the Georges. So there's 2 Morristown connections in this house. Howard George was here to work for H.T. Hackney, which is a nationwide grocery wholesaler and distributor that's still in Knoxville. And I have very few stories from their period. I haven't been able to talk to any family members who lived here, but a grandson of these folks, who's the son of one of the children who grew up here, was able to send me this picture. This is 5-year-old Harriet George, one of 3 children who lived in the house. And this is the first picture of the house and the first picture of anyone who lived in the house. So this is little Harriet George, age 5, around about 1947, the last year that they lived in the house. And Mr. George went back to Morristown, where he went on to own the Five and Dime chain that was really big up there. He was like a Chamber of Commerce president. So he's more of a fixture in Morristown history. But thanks to them, we have this wonderful picture. And then we go back to Sale, and this is really the mother lode of information on the house. This is the ad that Howard George put in the News Sentinel to sell the house. Again, it's described 7-room brick home with tile roof. And you can see he describes a guest wardrobe, which is the coat closet, a sunroom, living room. He puts the size of the living room. So if you're trying to mine information about a historic house and you want to know how it was used at a certain time, This is like a Rosetta Stone because it tells you how many bathrooms they had, how they used the rooms, how they described the rooms, what kind of blinds they had. I mean, this is just awesome. They even described the kind of furnace that was in the basement, a Holland furnace, a GE water heater, the size of a lot, which hasn't changed, well drained and beautified with dogwoods. We're even talking about the trees that were planted in the lot when they sold the house, redbuds, crepe myrtle, shrubs. And then this is the real kicker. It was built before the day of please don't rain construction, and it will please the particular home seeker for the low price of $15,750. And then we have a phone number for appointments. So again, you get the owner's phone number. And this brings us into the period that most of my island home neighbors will know of this house, the Carlson period. Lib and Gordon Carlson and their kids lived here for the better part of 60 years. And they really left their stamp on island home. Gordon Carlson was a professor and a department chair at UT, a world traveler. And the coolest thing about this guy, in my opinion, is that he wrote his own memoir on like an early Radio Shack computer in the basement that I'm speaking to you from tonight. I'm actually not in the front yard. I'm coming to you through the magic of Zoom. That's outside. And he tells all these fascinating idiosyncratic stories about a steamship voyage that he took around the world, I believe in his 20s, his experiences as a professor at UT, and it's packed with stories about this house too, and things that happened in it, including the day that they bought the house. They walked out of their showing and there was another couple in the front yard, and they realized the competition they were going to have, and they immediately went to the realtor and made an offer. So they got the house by the skin of their teeth. And during their 60 years here, they raised 3 children. This is Betty, the youngest, Shirley, the oldest daughter, with their mom here in the yard. And again, look, you've got pictures of my house. So I can see, it's the original windows are still there, but this is before the storm windows are put on. And then their little son, Jimmy, pictured here in 1950, again, outside the house. And awesome pictures of Jimmy. Apparently it was a well-rounded athlete. And here is this wonderful reminiscences and random reflections that Dr. Carlson wrote. He was a fascinating guy. He and his wife loved to travel. They traveled the world. He brought back a Porsche from Germany, and I recently learned that it came in the hold of a Pan Am airliner because his daughter Shirley was a flight attendant. And that Porsche was a fixture in the neighborhood. They used to own the house next door where my neighbors, the Rodockers, live now. And that was rented to other current neighbors for a time. And he kept his Porsche there. And I think he gave like $5 off the monthly rent because his Porsche was in the garage. So, and I'm told too by his son-in-law that he actually worked on the Porsche himself. So he was really a Renaissance man. And I won't bore you with all the details of how the rooms were arranged. And what was valuable to me was to learn how the house used to be used. But between this book and an essay that daughter Shirley Carlson Bowen wrote, and phone conversations with Gordon Carlson's daughter Betty Borgmeyer, I've just been able to collect wonderful stories of their childhoods in Island Home, of them playing half rubber and softball and other games in the yard, of riding the bus to town with favorite bus drivers who would wait on the girls and let them ride the whole route and back just to see downtown, going shopping downtown on the bus, sledding in the snow like Dorinda talked about. And there were trees that were planted in the backyard, some of which exist and some of which are gone. There's a wonderful story about a little boy who, I know his name, we know his name, but I'm leaving it out, would climb a tree in the backyard and stare at the Carlsons through the dining room window while they ate dinner because he wanted to play with the kids. And in one version of the story, I got the impression that Gordon Carlson was irritable about it because he got up and closed the blinds rather than throwing the kid out of the tree. It's like Zacchaeus in the tree staring at you while you're having dinner. But we've come to the conclusion it was good natured and he just was having fun with the kid. And in another instance, another neighborhood boy apparently climbed that tree and climbed into the balcony in my backyard and snuck in to steal some valuable coins in Jimmy's collection, and didn't get away with it. He didn't realize that room, which is now my guest room, was the Carlson's master bedroom. And Dr. Carlson opened the door, greeted him, and escorted him out the front door and told him not to come back. So stories like that. Also learning that I was able to date the chain link fence that surrounds my backyard because Dr. Carlson tells a story about thinking he had locked his grandchild in. Dr. Carlson comes home from work at UT And the grandson says, "Hey, welcome home, granddad, and let me let you in," and opens the fence and lets him in. So he realized that the kid could get out the whole time. Some of my other friends who've lived here between the Carlsons and us have uncovered finds like this. This is the original 1958 air conditioning plan that shows us when the old coal furnace in the basement was replaced. And in the letters that Ann Bocock wrote, she talks about how you had to stoke the furnace. It was a furnace with no stoker. And if you know anything about Knoxville history, you know that the air used to be just choked with the smoke of thousands of coal furnaces. And many old houses in this neighborhood and in Old North and Fourth and Guild have got the little openings in the side of the house where they would dump the coal in. This meant that somebody had to come downstairs and shovel coal in a couple times a day, and it was dirty and it was nasty. They eventually replaced that with a furnace that had a stoker, I believe. But in 58, we get a natural gas furnace. And using another trick that I'll share with you later in my presentation, I was able to find newspaper articles about the house. So here you see the house in the background of an engagement notice in the Knoxville News Sentinel in 1968. This is for daughter Shirley and her fiance Peter, or Jeff is the name he goes by. And you can see the address, 2134. So you see they've changed the address from 126 to 2134 in 1950. And this is the first time the house appears in the newspaper in picture. And then this is one of my favorite pictures. This is the Carlsons in the late 90s at the height of their time in Knoxville. And this, I can see how the paint colors have changed. Gordon passed away. Forgive me, I've forgotten the year, but the last Carlson to live in this house was his wife, Lib. She passed away in 2007, ending 6 decades here. And this is her granddaughter, Elizabeth, who had been living with her and helping care for her, and then helped to clean the house out and stage it and get it ready to sell. And this is an awesome picture of her posing across the railings on the front porch. Now, I've been privileged to, as I said, have many conversations with the Carlsons. Betty Carlson came back to visit during the pandemic and brought the dinner bell that Lib Carlson would ring to summon the kids back to the house. And we were able to walk around, and she actually showed me how rooms had changed. And I'm not going to bore you with those details. I'll show you some before after pictures in a minute. But it was just valuable to have that first person perspective. Speaking of which, I think Shirley and Betty are both here. If you want to unmute, do you all want to add anything to what I've said about your time in the house and what it was like to live here? And I'll try to find you and unmute you if you're not able to do it yourself.
Shirley and Jeff are definitely here and enjoying it very much.
What can you add? And Jeff, it was you that told me about Gordon working on his own Porsche.
Well, he was truly a Renaissance man, and just in many other ways. I mean, there was very little that he didn't know about an awful lot of things.
Yeah, what kind of a scientist was he exactly? I'm puzzled by what he writes in his book. What did he study?
Let me have Shirley. What kind of scientist was he?
He was a zoologist. He studied microbiology, cell division kind of thing.
Didn't it involve radiation sometimes? Or am I imagining?
Radiation biology. Yeah, he studied radiation on grasshoppers. He studied radiation. I remember occasionally we would go out in the field and look for grasshoppers so he could study their eggs and radiation somehow. I don't understand it all.
Yeah, that's what I read, and it just didn't seem right. So I was right. He was irradiating grasshoppers. Okay. What was it like growing up in the house on the middle of the boulevard? Was it a fun neighborhood to grow up in?
Oh yeah, there were children all around. We had our playmates who we played with, and I remember one thing I didn't tell you in our talks or our emails. Occasionally there'd be a big rainstorm up the street, about 5 or 6 houses. There was a dip in the road, and we'd all go up there and swim in the puddles that this rain created.
Wow.
My mother was rather horrified because it was filthy dirty.
Now, I'm a little horrified as a parent, honestly. And do you remember sledding in the snow?
Oh, yeah, we went up there by the deaf school. It's always just go to the deaf school and slide down the hill. And all our friends from school were there because school was called off.
And she's referring folks to the Tennessee School for the Deaf, which is at the east end of the boulevard. And it's now gated, so you can't go sled in it. Everybody sleds into Island Home Park now. Do you remember when they put the park in, the current park?
No, I don't. I don't know. We go up the top of Fisher Place and turn left and get to the top of the hill. And I don't know whether is that hill still there, or is it developed? I guess the hill's still.
I'm not sure exactly which hill you're talking about, but
Well, I don't know.
Here, it just might have a house on it.
Yeah, probably it's developed now.
And do you remember the trolley that used to come in? Did y'all ride that, or you
No, I don't think we
just
were there.
busted?
I don't remember any trolley.
Okay. And I think I can see that Betty and her husband are here, but I've asked them to unmute. They're joining us by phone. Are you all able to join in and talk, or is that possible? I'm going to take their silence to mean no. But I'll tell you where you can find more of Betty's stories too. So the Carlsons just left a huge stamp on Island Home, and everything changed for this house when Jeff and Karen Williamson bought it in 2007. They're architects. Jeff was involved in the big Sacred Heart Cathedral project in Bearden on North Shore, lots of other things in Knoxville. And they had actually were living in and renovating a house down the street when they were doing this project. And they were trying to decide which house to live in. She was pregnant with a second child. They picked the house that needed the least work, but she said it almost killed them trying to renovate two houses at once. Their work on the other house was featured in Cottage Living and received an award from Knox Heritage. So they're the real deal, and they did a wonderful job on the house. So they shared with me between 60 and 70 pictures that they took right before the renovation. And these were really eye-opening for me to see what they did. So you can see the old paint scheme here. And I'm going to show you just a couple of befores and afters. This is the living room in 2007. And then here it is after their work. So they really kept the best parts, but added a lot of great new stuff too. The kitchen with cabinets that Gordon Carlson built then and now. And I cleaned it up as much as I could before I took the picture. The master bedroom upstairs was, and this is so fascinating to me, everything is painted in the same shade of blue, including the mantles and the windowsills. And they undid that. And you see they've actually walled in. This bedroom went all the way from the front of the house to the back, and they walled it in to create a master bath. And then here's the half bath downstairs. And you can see what it looked like before and how they've gussied it up there. And what's interesting to me, surprising about the Carlsons' time here is for 6 decades, the better part of that, you've got 2 adults and 3 kids, and then a bunch of grandkids coming. They had 1 master bath upstairs and 1 half bath on the main floor, and nobody complained about, access to the bathroom or the shower. Carlson's made it work. But thanks to the Williamsons, we now have 2 halves and 2 fulls, so we can live like modern Americans. And again, this is the couple that was doing the work when the contractors found John Spears' 1930s pornography on the walls. And unfortunately, they gave it to a friend of a friend who, oddly enough, collects period pornography. I didn't know that was a thing. So I'd love to see those magazines, but they're long gone, and I can't share them with you, even if they were clean enough. A little over a year later, they sell the house to this family, Russ and Nicole Wilson. These are the folks we bought it from. And they told me that they loved their time in the house as well. They watched the annual trick-or-treating circus in Island Home go from 500 people to the 1,000 to 1,500 that we get every Halloween now. We're kind of like Knoxville's trick-or-treating destination. They love gardening, and they actually did a professional landscaping. They gave me the plans for that, and we're still enjoying those plantings. So another cool artifact from the history of the house. The biggest thing that changed during the Wilsons' time here was the demise of the 2 big trees in the front yard. I don't know what kind these are. I'm going to go with some kind of maple, but I'm not sure. Thunderstorm, big deal thunderstorm, July of 2012. I said 2011 earlier, it's 2012. This was the huge storm that downed a bunch of trees and the Great Smokies that brought national news outlets here. And it brought one of these trees down on the roof, which is why they had to replace the roof upstairs. I think Russ and one of the kids were in the room when it hit. And then they saw reporters working in the neighborhood and knew that stuff was going on, but actually were surprised to be in the house watching the news and see themselves, like their house was on the news live. There was a reporter in the street in front of the house reporting live. And this is pictures of that replacement roof work going on. So I'm told that our house was actually on the national news, but I haven't found any proof of that. I'd love to see it. And then my wife, Krista, and my son, Joseph, and I, and our cat, Tallulah, moved in 2014 when Krista was recruited at the Baker Center at UT. And we're, still making history in the house today. So you've got 6 families over 94 years. So we could call it the Spears, Bocock, George, Carlson, Wilson, Jordan house if we wanted to open a museum here. I hope that we're here long enough to celebrate the centennial, and I'll throw a party and you're all invited. But it's been a great time in this house. So I've talked about as long as I'm supposed to, but I want to share with you how I found what I found. The best place to start if you're in Knoxville is the East Tennessee History Center. And I've even conveniently given you the hours of operation here on the right-hand side of the screen. This is a 3-layer cake of opportunities for you to learn about Knoxville history. The museum is on the ground floor. The county archives are on the 2nd floor. And the county library has the McClung Historical Collection upstairs. So McClung is the place to start. They have late hours on Monday. They're open until 8:30. Anybody can use it free. The first place to go is the first shelf unit on the right where the city's directories are. What you do is you start with a modern year and you work your way back. And these directories are split between names and addresses. So you can search by name or you can search by address. But you work your way back until you can build a list of all the people who either owned or rented, who lived in your house. And this was how I was able to track down the year that the address changed when the city made the block system change in 1950. And I was able to find the names of the Georges who rented. And then I took that information and went on to ancestry.com and tracked down, got the names of the kids by looking at old census records, and then just started Googling. And that's how I found Dorinda. She was easy to find because she's a published author, but you can find people that are harder to find too. And that's how I found the George family and got the picture of young Harriet George. The next stop is to go up to the county archives. And the folks here, Eric Head and his team, are really helpful. They're going to show you how to use an old microfilm machine. And there's an index to deeds. So you start with the index and Eric will help you figure out which one to look in. You scroll through that microfilm until you find the book number for your house, and all the deeds will be listed book by book. And this is what that process looks like. You find the book and page number for your deeds, and then you can go upstairs in the city county building and pull the actual deed books. And that's where you get to see your actual deeds. So you can build those histories too. And that tells you what people paid for the house when, and then you can go on to Google and just type in currency translator for inflation, and you can find out, if they bought the house for $10,000, that's really $200,000 now or whatever. And then the final piece, and this is a real treasure here in Knox County, Tennessee has digitized our local newspapers. So I searched for the names of the people that I knew lived in the house and for the original and the later address of the house. And searching for the address found the sales ads, which were just invaluable pieces of information about the house. And also things like the engagement notices and just other news items. And it turns out that it was conventional in newspaper reporting until basically the 1980s. Anytime you would talk about a person, you would tell their address. 48-year-old Gordon Carlson of 126 Island Home Boulevard today said, can you imagine with our concerns about privacy now, actually giving your address to the newspaper for a story about you. But if you want to learn more about this, you can learn from the experts at the History Center. They've got a genealogy workshop with instructor Vicki Bills, who's a reference librarian, coming up next month on the 14th from 6 to 8. And they will walk you through how to do it. If you can't make it to this workshop, they also have a handout on the front desk that has basics of all the things that I pointed out. So that is the story of my house. And some of it is stuff that would only be interesting to people who live here, but I just was blown away by the stories about the Spears. I mean, my goodness, drunken carousing in the alley behind my house, honky tonks, traveling salesmen that prove all the stereotypes of that career field. It was just a treasure trove. And I just regret I didn't start this sooner, because as recently as maybe 7 or 8 years ago, there were probably people in the neighborhood who were still living who might remember the Spearses. I do worry that if everything I've been taught about the afterlife is true, and John really did find Jesus, and I run into him on the pearly streets, I'm afraid he's going to say, Michael, I got right, I remarried, and Reverend Barber came to the house and everybody forgot, and you brought it all back and you drug it out on Zoom for people from all over the country. Why did you do that?
Oh, Michael, you asked about Jenkins and Jenkins, and it just so happens I have a book written by the main Jenkins in that unusual law firm, The Terror of Tellico Plains. This guy was one of the most famous lawyers who ever lived in East Tennessee. His partner Jenkins was not even related to him. He was just a guy that he met and was impressed with him, a younger guy. But Ray Jenkins became famous in the 1950s during the Army McCarthy trial, because he was the guy that was the tough guy from Tennessee who was asking the hard questions of Joe McCarthy and his cronies. But I actually knew him as a kid. I mowed his grass.
So you're saying that one of the two Jenkins, who is not related to the other Jenkins, got into Congress and stood up to Joe McCarthy?
Not into Congress. He was a lawyer who was hired by Congress and to be the one of the attorneys who was kind of moderating the proceedings in the Army McCarthy hearings.
That's crazy. Knoxville
Yeah.
is a node that seems to connect every historical thread.
Yeah, he was nationally famous for about a month in 1954 or whatever it was.
Did he survive that, or was he blacklisted?
No, he survived everything. He was still working as a lawyer in the 1970s. So he was and he was famous for some other cases too. One got in Time magazine when he got a guy off for taking a picture of the guy who was shooting at him. This guy took a picture of this guy who was literally shooting a gun at him, and you can see the smoke coming out of the gun. And the Time magazine caption was "not guilty" because Ray Jenkins kind of messed with the process and got him off. Wow. But he was amazing. Really, he was from Tellico Plains, but really a tough customer.
But we don't know which Jenkins it was that took on Beatrice Spears' divorce case.
Yeah, we can probably figure it out.
You might be able to read the cursive and the signature and figure it out.
Yeah. But anyway, fascinating presentation. Yeah, and like I say, you've raised the bar for house research. We're going to have to work harder to interview all the descendants and everybody else that I really interview people when I do a house project. But that does bring in a lot of color, a lot of personality to it.
Well, and again, I didn't go into this because it's just the room layout of my house, but the Williamsons radically reordered the upstairs. Both the main floor and the top floor. They created new openings, but when they did, they harvested door jambs and door hardware from other places, so you can't tell what's 94 years old and what's from 2007. They reversed the openings of closets and moved the historic doors to create master bedrooms, but combining their old pictures and what they told me in their interview with the stories from Shirley and Betty, I can understand how the house used to be and how they used it. And astonishingly, the Carlsons didn't want a TV. They finally put one upstairs in the hall. And the Carlson kids watched TV sitting on the floor in the hall.
Well,
so they were frugal people.
Sounds like my great aunt. Yeah. And but this was a fascinating evening. Thanks a lot. Thanks to Michael. Thanks to Paul James for making this possible, and also Nicole Stahl, our assistant, who also always helps with the technical aspects of this. And thanks everybody for coming out. This has been a very well attended episode. And come back next third Thursday. We'll have something more, or try to make something equally interesting next month if we can. But and appreciate it. Have a good night, everybody.